Right now, like as you sit there listening to this, your brain is actively deciding what to forget.
Yeah, it really is. It's basically an incredibly ruthless, highly efficient deletion machine.
Exactly. I mean, if you were to just sit and read a dense textbook for 6 hours straight today, basic human biology dictates that you'll likely forget up to 70% of that information by tomorrow morning.
Right.
Your brain just views all that passive reading as irrelevant data and simply tosses it right into the cognitive trash can.
Which is a pretty terrifying reality if you're currently, dedicating your evenings or your weekends to mastering new
Oh,
material.
absolutely terrifying.
Because the default setting of the human brain isn't to remember, it's to forget. Storing information requires a massive amount of metabolic energy.
And today, we are going to hack that biological deletion process. So welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me back.
Our mission today is decoding the actual science and strategy of effective learning. We're extracting the core insights from this highly practical, surprisingly rigorous guide titled, What Boarders Need to Know, Top Revision Tips for Year 11 and Year 13 Students.
It's a fantastic source document.
It really is. And look, whether you're a high school student prepping for a massive final or a professional grinding for an industry certification or, just someone who loves catching up on a complex new field, you are the third person in this conversation today.
Yeah, we're so glad you're here with us.
Our goal is to upgrade your cognitive toolkit so you can work smarter, not just harder.
But to do that, we really have to completely discard the way most of us were culturally conditioned to study.
Right. The whole cramming at midnight thing.
Exactly. The guide establishes a core philosophy right out of the gate, which is that high-quality learning is an ecosystem, and it's built over weeks and months, not days.
Not the night before.
No, definitely not. It requires routine, discipline, and biological well-being to perform at your true cognitive potential. The traditional model of locking yourself in a room 2 days before a deadline and cramming until your eyes bleed is, well, it's fundamentally broken.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even get into the mechanics of writing data to the brain, the source makes a major point about setting the stage right.
Yeah, the foundation has to be there first.
You cannot execute a high-level learning strategy without a clear map and a highly controlled physical workspace. The guide insists on starting early and creating this hyper-specific, realistic timetable where you break subjects down into granular topics.
Granular being the key word there. You can't just block out 3 hours on a Tuesday and label it science or marketing strategy.
Yeah, that's way too vague.
That ambiguity is the enemy of execution.
I used to be so guilty of this. I would sit down with the best intentions, but without a specific topic plan, I'd experience what I now realize was just the illusion of work.
Oh, we've all been there. The color coding phase.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I would spend 2 hours just color coding a beautiful, elaborate study schedule with like 5 different highlighters, and I felt incredibly productive.
But you hadn't actually learned a single thing.
Not a single thing. It was like organizing a chaotic garage, but instead of actually sorting the tools or the paint, I just bought some nice labels and called it a day.
What you're experiencing there is a really well-documented psychological phenomenon, and it ties directly into what psychologists call cognitive load.
Cognitive load. Okay, explain that for us.
Well, keeping your revision plan, your priorities, and your worries strictly in your head is basically like having 50 tabs open on your web browser.
Oh, I hate that. It slows the whole computer down.
Exactly. It silently eats up your brain's RAM in the background. Unfinished or undefined tasks create this persistent mental itch.
So writing down a hyper-specific, topic-based timetable is basically closing all those background tabs.
That is the exact mechanism. When you write down that on Tuesday at 4 p.m., you are specifically studying the mitochondrial electron transport chain.
Very specific.
Right. But by doing that, you are completely offloading the organizational burden from your working memory onto the paper. So when you finally sit down, 100% of your processing power goes toward the actual studying.
Instead of burning precious mental energy deciding what to study.
Precisely.
So the schedule acts as an external hard drive for your anxiety.
That's a great way to put it.
And the source takes this externalization a step further with the physical environment. It mandates studying in a quiet, organized space, keeping only the necessary materials on the desk, and aggressively reducing distractions.
Especially phones. Phones are the absolute worst for this.
Totally. It even recommends using libraries or supervised prep sessions. But I have to ask, and push back a little here, isn't a hyper-organized, completely silent desk a bit stifling?
How do you mean?
Well, I know people who swear they work better in a chaotic coffee
Oh,
shop.
you did.
Doesn't this strict environment feel too rigid?
What's fascinating here is how heavily the human brain relies on physical environmental signals to trigger internal chemical states. This concept is called context-dependent memory. When the guide advises keeping only the materials you need on a clean desk, it is actively managing your visual cortex.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning every single random object on your desk, a coffee mug, a stack of unpaid bills, your phone, is a visual stimulus. Your occipital lobe has to process it and then actively choose to ignore it.
Oh, wow. Wait, really? So even if I'm not looking at my phone, the fact that it's sitting in my peripheral vision means my brain is spending energy actively not looking at it?
Exactly. It drains your executive function. It's like a leaky faucet of mental energy.
That is wild.
By creating a stark, dedicated study environment, you remove that low-level drain. Furthermore, if you only ever do deep work at that specific clean desk, the desk itself becomes a neurological cue.
So you train yourself.
Yeah. Eventually, just sitting in that specific chair will automatically trigger your brain to shift into a focused state. It associates that physical location with cognitive effort.
You are basically Pavlov's dog, but instead of a bell making you salivate, a clean desk makes you focus.
That's spot on.
So now that the cognitive RAM is cleared, the background tabs are closed, and we're sitting at this highly optimized desk. How do we actually write the information to the hard drive?
Right, the actual studying part.
Yeah, because the guide draws a massive, uncompromising line in the sand between active and passive revision.
It is arguably the most critical distinction in the entire text. The source outright states that simply reading your notes or highlighting a textbook is entirely insufficient for actual learning.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because I think most of us assume that if our eyes are moving across a page, learning is happening.
It feels like work.
It does. But passive reading or highlighting is basically like watching someone else lift weights and expecting your own muscles to get strong.
Yeah, you aren't doing the heavy lifting yourself.
Right. The guide demands active strategies.
Mhm.
Things like practicing past exam questions, using flashcards, self-testing, creating mind maps, and my personal favorite, teaching the topic to a friend by explaining it aloud.
That's a brilliant one. Because the reason passive reading feels so productive is due to a cognitive bias known as the fluency illusion.
The fluency illusion.
Yeah, so when you read a well-written chapter for the second time, your brain recognizes the words. It feels easy. You mistake that feeling of easy recognition for actual mastery.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
But recognition is not retrieval.
Right. You can recognize a song on the radio, but that doesn't mean you can play it on the piano.
A perfect way to look at it. Active recall, like staring at a blank flashcard or forcing yourself to explain a concept aloud, feels terrible.
It really does. You stutter, you draw blanks, you feel stupid.
Exactly. It is frustrating. But from a biological standpoint, that specific feeling of struggle is the exact trigger for memory formation.
The struggle is the signal.
Yes. When you force your brain to retrieve a piece of information from scratch, you are firing a specific neural pathway. And the more you fire it, the more your brain wraps that pathway in a fatty substance called myelin.
Myelination. That's the insulation that makes the neural signal travel faster and stronger, right?
Yes. Reading is just sensory input. Active retrieval is what physically thickens the cables in your brain.
And the source pairs this active recall with another crucial technique, which is spaced repetition.
Yes, the timing of the active recall is just as important as the recall itself.
Wait, before we move on, let's clarify spaced repetition for anyone who hasn't encountered the term, because the guide mentions it as a top-tier strategy. It's not just taking random breaks, is it?
Not at all. Spaced repetition is a highly specific method designed to combat the biological deletion process we talked about at the beginning.
The cognitive trash can.
Right. It's famously modeled as the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus discovered that memory decay is mathematically predictable.
Interesting.
To make a memory permanent, you have to actively retrieve the information right at the exact moment your brain is about to forget it.
So you time the flashcards.
Yeah. You review a concept after one day, then maybe after 3 days, then a week, then a month. Each successful retrieval flattens the forgetting curve until the knowledge is just permanent.
You are repeatedly telling your brain's deletion machine, no, do not throw this away, I still need it.
Exactly.
But of course, you can't do that heavy neural lifting indefinitely. The source is incredibly strict about time blocks. It points out that the brain can only concentrate deeply for limited periods.
You have to give the brain a chance to recover.
Right. It recommends a structure very similar to the Pomodoro technique. So 25 to 40 minutes of highly focused, active study, followed by a 5 to 10-minute break. And you repeat that for maybe 3 or 4 cycles.
And crucially, schedule lighter sessions and rest days to maintain your long-term motivation.
Yes, but the guide has very specific rules for that 5 to 10-minute break. It says you should move your body, drink water, and actively avoid scrolling on social media.
Which is where most people completely sabotage their own study sessions.
I really want to dig into that sabotage. Because if a break is supposed to be a break, why is looking at Instagram or checking the news for 5 minutes so detrimental? Isn't my brain off the clock?
You'd think so, right? But if we connect this to the bigger picture of how the brain processes information, we have to look at what happens the moment you stop studying.
Okay, what happens?
Your brain doesn't just power down. The hippocampus, the part of your brain holding that new, fragile information you just learned, is still actively working in the background.
Oh, so it's still running the program.
Yeah, it is just beginning to consolidate what you actively recalled. If you immediately open social media, you fall victim to something called retroactive interference.
Retroactive interference, meaning the new thing you were looking at goes backward in time to mess up the old thing.
In a sense, yes. You are suddenly flooding your working memory buffer with highly stimulating, emotionally engaging, and completely irrelevant new stimuli.
Like a flashy video or a controversial news headline.
Or just a message from a friend. Your brain only has so much processing power, so it aggressively prioritizes this intense new sensory data and simply drops the fragile math formula or history data it was trying to consolidate.
Wow. You are actively overwriting the last 40 minutes of hard work.
That is wild, isn't it? Scrolling your phone during a study break is basically hitting the delete key on the session you just finished.
Which explains why the guide recommends moving your body or drinking water instead.
Exactly. When you stand up and take a brief walk, you increase blood flow and oxygen to the prefrontal cortex.
Just getting the blood moving.
Yes, this literally accelerates the flushing out of metabolic waste products like adenosine that build up in the brain during intense focus. Movement clears the biological fog while actually protecting the fragile new memories.
So the break isn't an off switch. It is a critical processing window.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's say you've mastered this. You've mapped out the specific topics. You've used active recall to thicken those neural pathways. You've protected the consolidation phase by walking around instead of scrolling.
You're doing great so far.
You have the facts locked in. The source then introduces what I like to call the hidden curriculum, because having the data encoded in your brain is only half the battle, right?
It really is. Knowing the facts is completely useless if you don't know how to demonstrate them under pressure.
A guide refers to this as exam technique. It explicitly warns that many students know the content perfectly well, but they lose massive amounts of marks simply because they are unfamiliar with the expectations of the exam itself.
The structural expectations, yes.
So what does this all mean? Well, to bridge this to the adult professional world, having perfect knowledge of the material is like knowing how to cook a great meal at home. But taking the exam is like being on a timed cooking show, where judges have a very specific, strict rubric.
That's a very stressful cooking show.
Right. You might make the most delicious soup in the world, but if the judges asked for a roasted chicken, you fail. Your hard work doesn't translate into recognized value.
A very apt translation. The source stresses that you must understand specific command words used in the test.
Command words like what?
Things like analyze, evaluate, or describe. If a question asks you to evaluate, but you only describe, you receive 0 points, regardless of how accurate your description is.
Because you didn't answer the prompt.
Exactly. It tells you to time yourself on past papers, practice structuring your essays, and brutally review the official mark schemes to see exactly how the invisible points are awarded.
It also tells you to systematically track this progress. Ticking the granular topics off your plan, recording the scores from those timed practice papers, and reflecting on the weak areas.
Seeing that improvement is crucial.
Now, I have to offer some genuine pushback here, because I personally hate administrative work.
Most people do.
When I am stressed and under a deadline, tracking progress, reviewing mark schemes, logging practice scores, it feels like a massive waste of time. I always think I could be using these 30 minutes to just read more material.
Sure, it feels like busy work.
Is this tracking really worth sacrificing actual study time for?
This raises an important question about human motivation and endurance. The tracking the guide recommends is not administrative overhead. It is a vital psychological tool.
How so?
You have to remember that a long-term study plan, whether it's for A-levels, a bar exam, or a medical board, is a marathon of delayed gratification.
Oh, yeah. It takes forever.
And when you are in the middle of a months-long revision process, you will inevitably hit a wall where it feels like you aren't making any progress.
The muddy waters of cognitive progress. You can't see the finish line.
And when you can't see the finish line, motivation collapses. Tracking your scores and physically ticking boxes off a list provides your brain with a micro hit of dopamine.
So it's chemical.
It gives you objective, indisputable proof of your growth to counter your subjective feeling of overwhelm.
It reminds you that the initial mistakes on the practice papers were just part of the learning curve.
Right. Seeing a score go from 40% to 60% keeps you in the fight. It proves that small, daily active recall efforts are compounding into measurable results.
It is the physical evidence that the invisible neuromyelination is actually happening.
Yes.
Okay, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
It regulates your morale, believe in the prep, as they say.
Exactly.
But that brings us to the ultimate point of failure. You can have the perfect topic-based timetable. You can have the best active recall flashcards in the world. You can deeply understand the boss's rubric and the mark schemes.
Yeah.
But all of that will spectacularly collapse if the biological vehicle carrying all that perfectly encoded data breaks down.
The human factor.
Yes, the human factor. The guide is adamant that revision success is intrinsically linked to physical and mental well-being.
It lists sleep as completely non-negotiable, noting that teenagers specifically need 8 to 9 hours a night.
It also mandates balanced nutrition to support concentration and exercise to improve mood. Crucially, it says you have to deliberately schedule downtime to prevent overwhelm.
Which is so hard to do when you're stressed.
It really is. Treating sleep and downtime as optional luxuries is like trying to drive a high-performance sports car with an empty gas tank and no oil.
You're just going to ruin the engine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But again, I struggle with this in practice. If I have a massive, career-defining presentation tomorrow morning and I still don't feel ready, going to sleep for 9 hours feels incredibly irresponsible.
The panic sets in.
Yeah. My biological panic response is screaming at me to stay up and pull an all-nighter. Doesn't 9 hours of sleep feel like lost study time to a stressed student?
It feels like it, but does giving in to that panic actually sabotage the data? It absolutely does.
Wow.
When you sacrifice sleep to study more, you are destroying the very mechanism of learning. The guide points out a fundamental biological fact that cannot be bypassed. Memory consolidation happens during sleep.
Let's really emphasize that for you, the listener.
Yeah.
The saving of the memory happens while you are unconscious.
Yes. To use a technological analogy, think of your hippocampus, the area where you hold new information during the day, as a small USB thumb drive.
Okay, I'm with you.
And think of your neocortex as the massive permanent hard drive. During the day, as you use active recall, you are loading files onto the USB drive.
Right.
But the transfer of those files from the USB drive to the permanent hard drive almost exclusively happens during the deep, slow-wave stages of sleep.
So what happens when you pull an all-nighter?
You are essentially trying to shove more and more files onto a USB drive that is already full. And then you format the drive before ever plugging it into the main computer.
Oh, no.
Without sleep, the transfer to the neocortex never happens. You wake up the next day, and a massive percentage of what you studied at 3 a.m. is simply gone.
You aren't losing study time when you sleep. You are biologically securing the study time you already completed.
Exactly.
That is a terrifying image with the USB drive,
Right.
but it totally shifts the perspective. Sleep is an active study session.
It really is. And beyond sleep, the guide addresses the emotional component of this biological vehicle, which is stress management.
Right, because stress can just derail everything.
It normalizes a little bit of stress, saying that feeling pressure just means you care about the outcome.
Which is good.
But excessive stress is toxic to performance.
Yeah.
And that toxicity is quite literal.
Literal toxicity.
Yeah, when you experience excessive unmanaged stress, your adrenal glands flood your system with cortisol. Cortisol evolved to help us run away from physical threats, like a predator.
Fight or flight.
Right. It pulls resources away from the prefrontal cortex, the logical, reasoning part of your brain, and sends them to your muscles. Cortisol literally, physically blocks the receptors in your hippocampus, preventing memory retrieval.
Which explains why you can know an answer perfectly well in your bedroom, but the moment you sit down in the exam hall, your mind goes completely blank.
The cortisol locked the filing cabinet.
Wow. So how do we fix that?
This is why the guide advises breaking large tasks down to reduce the threat level. It says to talk to mentors or boarding staff, practice breathing or mindfulness, and keep perspective. Exams do not define your future.
Emotional regulation is what actually keeps cortisol levels low enough so you can access the data you worked so hard to save.
Exactly. The guide also touches on collaboration as a way to manage this ecosystem, studying with others.
Ah, study groups.
But it has very strict rules to protect the group's emotional bandwidth. It says study groups are incredible if you use them to test each other, discuss tough concepts, and share resources.
But it explicitly warns against turning revision into social time.
Yes, and more importantly, it warns against comparing your progress with your peers in ways that spike anxiety.
Because the moment you start comparing how many hours you studied against how many hours your friends studied, you trigger that exact emotional threat response we just discussed.
Cortisol spikes, anxiety rises, and cognitive function is impaired.
So learning is profoundly strengthened through collaborative discussion. Because explaining concepts aloud is the ultimate active recall. But it must be kept purposeful and structured to protect everyone from mutual panic.
It is all about protecting the machine.
Okay, so to bring all these pieces together for you, the listener, what this deep dive really reveals is that successful learning is absolutely not about last-minute pressure, pulling heroic all-nighters, or logging endless painful hours, passively rereading a textbook.
Far from it.
It is a carefully managed biological and psychological ecosystem. It is about clearing your cognitive RAM with specific topic plans.
Yep.
It's about triggering myelination through the struggle of active recall and spaced repetition. It's about understanding the rubric of the game you are playing. And above all, it is about fiercely protecting your physical vehicle through sleep and stress management.
It really serves as a fundamental operating manual for human cognition, regardless of your age or your profession. These are lifelong skills.
Absolutely. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to hand it over for a final thought.
Yeah, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own, building on the biological realities we've uncovered today.
Okay, lay on us.
If the physical thickening of neural pathways requires the struggle of retrieval, and if memory consolidation strictly happens during the unconscious hours of sleep, and if clearing metabolic waste requires us to step completely away from our screens,
Where are you going with this?
it makes you wonder, could it be that the most important part of learning is actually the periods when we aren't studying at all?
Oh, wow.
What if true intellectual mastery doesn't require constant, relentless consumption of information, but actually demands periods of intentional forgetting, silence, and profound rest?
Because in those murky waters of cognitive progress, it turns out the moments you think you are doing absolutely nothing might just be the exact moments your brain is doing the heaviest lifting of all.
Exactly.
What a great thought to end on. Until next time, keep exploring.